Well, hello again. I am still Mr. Laskowski, and I am still your guide through American history. Not to mention, I'm also the host of this ongoing series, AP United States History, and you. As you take notes on this presentation, think about the ways that what we cover today includes both material from your chapter reading assignment and some new things that you might not have known before. But between your homework and your notes on this presentation, you should be able to compile a pretty good record of the period leading up to and including the Compromise of 1850. So let's get right to it, shall we? This unit is entitled Expansion, Conflict, and Division. You could probably guess that the division is the Southern states' secession from the Union and the resulting Civil War. This presentation will cover the things that contributed to that division, namely expansion and conflict. And I think the best place to start is with this picture right here. It's called American Progress by the artist John Gast. Take a look at what you see here. I mean, obviously, the central figure is a terrifyingly large 100-foot tall white woman floating across the plains. This is Columbia, the personification of the United States, carrying a book of knowledge with her and stringing a telegraph wire behind her. Trailing Columbia are groups of white settlers, white miners, white farmers, and innovations like the railroad and the steel plow. In other words, we're bringing white civilization to the West. And look at how she seems to be pushing the dark clouds away as she floats west, and how the Native Americans scurry in fear, living out the doctrine of move or die. The message is clear. White civilization is coming to the West. Subtle it is not, but neither is America. And often this painting is used to describe the concept of manifest destiny, that belief that it was the United States' unique destiny to one day spread from sea to shining sea. Of course, you probably know by now that things didn't run smoothly just because the Americans pushed west to the Pacific Ocean. Indeed, you could say that the expansion eventually led to conflict, and that conflict eventually led to division, which is why the title of this presentation is Expansion, Conflict, and Division. But before all that, a quick diversion to cover a bit of political history you might have missed. Well, you might remember that the era of good feeling, remember that? When the Democrat-Republican Party ruled without opposition? Well, that lasted, of course, until the so-called corrupt bargain of 1824, after which the old Democrat Republicans renamed themselves the National Republicans before finally settling on a new brand, the Whigs, in honor of a similarly minded party in Great Britain. The Whigs became the party that opposed Jackson, opposed the Democratic Party, and pretty much everything it stood for. So it makes sense that the Whigs sort of resembled Hamilton's Federalist Party, with one significant addition. The Whigs opposed any expansion in the practice of slavery. Not because they were abolitionists, mind you, but because they knew that more land in the South and West meant more states with slavery and more power for the hated Jacksonian Democrats. So they favored expansion, but only in northern areas, like Oregon, and they opposed it in southern areas, like Texas. Well, of course, it was hard for the Whigs to get much power considering the size and strength of Jackson's coalition in the 1830s. But in 1840, the Whigs felt that they actually had a chance to win. Recall that President Martin Van Buren had presided over 4 tough years, including the Panic of 1837, which weakened the Democratic brand heading into 1840. The Whigs, tired of losing, decided not to nominate Henry Clay for president, instead opting for a war hero, William Henry Harrison, the victor at Tippecanoe. To try to peel away some Southern support, the Whigs also nominated ex-Democrat John Tyler as Harrison's running mate, and thus was established the first great campaign slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Well, the election itself was a circus, as the Whigs blamed the Democrats for the panic, calling the president Martin Van Ruin, and adopting the phrase log cabin and hard cider to make William Henry Harrison seem more like a common man, which he totally wasn't. But the strategy worked. Harrison and Tyler won the election of 1840. However, that is a year that ends in a zero. And so Harrison took the oath of office. Despite the dreary weather, he refused to wear a topcoat as he delivered an unusually long inaugural address. I think you see where this is going. Then Harrison caught the sniffles from the inauguration, got sick, and died just a few weeks after having taken office. In truth, we can say that he's probably the only man in politics who was killed by his own speech. But we know the truth about what happened. It was the curse of Tecumseh. But the consequences of Harrison's death were that the presidency now was in the hands of a new person, John Tyler, him of and Tyler too fame. As John Tyler was the first person to take office upon the death of a president, he immediately faced suspicion that he wasn't a legitimate president. Whigs hated him because they remembered that he had originally been a Democrat, and Democrats hated him because he switched parties to join the Whigs. And this is why John Tyler was often thought of as the man without a party. Suffice it to say, he was not very popular. In fact, most of Harrison's cabinet resigned in protest. But let's take a minute to give credit to Secretary of State Daniel Webster. Remember him? He stuck around long enough to negotiate yet another treaty between the British and the United States, this one appropriately called the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. Please add this to your list of treaties. The treaty finally resolved the issue of where the border between Maine and Canada should be, something that only Webster, Ashburton, and three bears living in northern Maine cared about, but it showed the growing strength of that so-called special relationship between the United States and Britain. But as far as meaningful events in Tyler's presidency, that's it. And it's sad to think that Tyler would be the last in a line of important presidents from Virginia. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Tyler? He doesn't quite measure up, which is why I always found it interesting to see how future generations would then memorialize old presidents. Washington, well, he got a monument and the capital city named after him. Jefferson got a memorial and the capital of Missouri. Madison, he got the capital of Wisconsin and the name of girls born in the early 21st century. But what did John Tyler get? It's a good question. Well, until 2021, if you drove up Interstate 95 toward Washington, D.C., and you looked to the side of the road, if you were lucky, you might have just glimpsed the John Tyler Community College. And that felt appropriate. He wasn't the last president from Virginia, but he was arguably the least president from Virginia, and Virginia decided that he was only worthy of having a local community college named after him. Now, friends, make sure you know that I'm not disparaging community colleges, not at all. A person can get a great education there for a whole lot less money than one of those swanky private colleges that might be on your dreams, that might be your dream school. But it does show you that Virginia thought of Tyler like Tippecanoe and Tyler too slogan. Washington, Jefferson, Madison, oh yes, and Tyler too. But actually, it gets worse. Because in the wake of the murder of George Floyd back in 2020, Americans began reconsidering some of the more problematic people that we had been honoring, especially those who had supported and benefited from slavery. And this is how Cameron Village got rebranded as the Village District, and Fort Bragg eventually became Fort Liberty. But what of John Tyler Community College? Well, not only was he a failed president, but he was also a man who owned over 20 enslaved people, which is why if you drive up Interstate 95 north of Petersburg today, you'll now see Bright Point Community College, this sign. Virginia hasn't forgotten that Tyler was one of its presidents. It just chose not to honor him by naming a college after him. So now that we've gotten all caught up on the political party system, let's turn our attention to
Texas. Let's remember that the Missouri Compromise had only allowed slavery to spread west if it was south of that 3630 parallel. And so that probably explains why so many Democrats and people who wanted to expand slavery set their sights upon Texas. But you ask, wasn't Texas still part of Spanish Mexico? Yes, but as you can see here in the map, only until the early 1820s when Mexico finally won its independence from Spain. And now, instead of a weak European power on its southwestern border, the United States had a weak independent nation on its southwest border, and all of that land, it attracted settlers. At first, Mexico was eager to have new settlers come to northern Mexico because it worried that the United States might just, I don't know, invade that territory and take it for itself. So it was better to have settlers come in, even if they were coming from America, to pledge their loyalty, their allegiance to Mexico, to settle this free land of Texas, and to protect the northern border against those dangerous American expansionists. Well, settlers, when they came to Texas, they had to pledge their allegiance to Mexico, and they had to abide by Mexican laws, including the law that barred anyone from owning or using enslaved people anywhere in Mexico, including Texas. So perhaps you can see the conflict already. American settlers, eager for land and eager to expand slavery, were able to come to Texas so long as they didn't bring along any enslaved people and promised to be loyal to Mexico, not the United States. So who might this appeal to? Well, in short, lots of land-hungry Americans who became known as the impresarios. Now, the impresarios is a great term, and I want to tell you all about it. I don't know if any of you are from Texas, but I have to say I spent 7 years there when I was a child, and people say everything is bigger in Texas, and it is mostly true, especially the egos. Texans, more than residents of any other state, have this weird elevated sense of their own self-importance. It's really quite annoying. And so it probably makes sense that the founding of Texas isn't just a story of expansion and settlement. It's essentially a holy movement, a divinely ordained event. In short, it's a Texas Bible story. And that story revolves around a man who saw all of that beautiful land out in Texas and thought, well, that's the promised land, you know, like Israel. And that makes the settlers of Texas the chosen people, like the Israelites. And who led the Israelites out of captivity and to the promised land? Moses, of course. So it stands to reason that the Texans would have their very own Moses figure, and that his name would be Moses, Moses Austin. Indeed, in the 1820s, Moses Austin gathered up a band of impresarios, mostly from Tennessee, to head out to the promised land of Texas. But if you know your book of Exodus, you probably know that Moses died before he reached the promised land. And so who led them the rest of the way? Well, Moses' son. And when Moses Austin died, who do you suppose led the settlers the rest of the way to the promised land of Texas? You guessed it, his son, Stephen F. Austin. Texas Bible stories indeed. Now, when Stephen Austin led his chosen people to the promised land, his group of settlers, known as the Old 300, they renounced their citizenship to the United States and pledged their loyalty to Mexico. And they claimed enormous tracts of land in South and East Texas. So far, this sounds like a win-win situation as settlers got land and Mexico got stability along its northern border. Well, all is not well, because along with their families, the settlers brought their English language, their American culture, their largely Protestant religious traditions, and a significant number of enslaved people. Hey, but wait, wasn't slavery forbidden in Texas? Yeah, but the empresarios brought them anyway, meaning that Mexico had to decide whether it was going to crack down on the settlers and risk rebellion or just quietly let them break Mexican law. Well, the government in Mexico chose, at least initially, to just leave the Texans alone, which meant that more settlers brought more enslaved people. And just like any time you get away with breaking the law over and over and over again, you begin to believe that breaking the law is your natural right. And the Texans came to believe that all Mexican laws just didn't apply to the Texans, and that always ends well. Well, after several years of what we might call salutary neglect, the Mexican government began to crack down on Texas once this man, the General Santa Anna, came to power. His uniform and his title suggest correctly that he was an autocratic ruler who did not respond well to independent-minded troublemakers. When Stephen Austin went to negotiate with Santa Anna, Austin was arrested and held captive for an extended period of time. By the time he got back to Texas, right, the Texans were in open revolt. And essentially, Mexico had said, follow our laws. And the Texans had said, make me. And so reports of conflict between the Mexican military and the white, largely Protestant, largely slave-owning, largely American settlers in Texas, they filtered back all the way to the United States. And this is the conflict that will eventually lead to the battle for Texas independence. Now, in the United States Congress, as the word gets back to Americans, both in Congress and across the country, Americans are going to react in an interesting way. As I said, in Congress, Davy Crockett, yes, that Davy Crockett, that guy right there, who had been elected to the House of Representatives from Tennessee, because that's how Tennessee does things. But once he heard what was happening in Texas, he resigned his position in Congress and made a farewell address to the House of Representatives. And there he was, dressed in his frontier clothing, and he said these immortal words in support of his friends in Texas. You all can all go to hell. I'm going to Texas. Which explains why Davy Crockett, who was an American legend at this point, and then apparently a congressman, is about to be even more legendary because he's going to go down to the Alamo, and he's in 1836 when he and all of the Texans there are going to be slaughtered. But I am getting ahead of myself. So, as Davy Crockett and other volunteers head on over to Texas, Santa Anna, the military man, decided that he would take direct command of the Mexican army and sent to crush the Texan revolutionaries. Just as, Washington had led troops against the Whiskey rebels. But in Texas, there were two bands of rebels that needed to be defeated, and so Santa Anna divided his army in half. He took one wing of the army itself to attack at San Antonio, but for the attack at Goliad, he gave command of the other wing of his army to a man with the most unfortunate name in military history, General Uriah. Uriah, that was his name. So how did all of this go? Well, in both cases, Texans holed up in mission churches, expecting that their presence on sacred ground would stop the Mexican soldiers from attacking and defiling a holy space. And it did. For a while, troops surrounded the churches and laid siege to them, waiting for the Texans to surrender or crack or starve or just give up. And when that didn't happen, then the soldiers attacked. At the Alamo in San Antonio, Santa Anna's men stormed into the sanctuary and slaughtered 189 Texans, including William Travis, James Bowie, and our old friend Davy Crockett. It was a bloodbath. Which is why it's kind of weird that today so many things, especially in San Antonio, are named after the Alamo. There's an Alamo Dome Stadium, an Alamo movie theater chain, and even an Alamo rental car company, which is probably the strangest to me. Imagine the advertising campaign. Come to Alamo Car Rental, where our prices slaughter and dismember the competition. It's barbaric. Well, if you could believe it, the carnage at Goliad was even worse. Fannon's Texans were overwhelmed and eventually captured. And then they were lined up one by one and executed with a gunshot to the head. Now, back when I was in seventh grade living in Dallas, Texas, and taking a full year-long course in Texas history, I heard this story from my teacher, who was also a coach, but he was also a Texas history teacher. And this story, frankly, I have to tell you, it might or it might not be true, but it is a story that Texans tell each other about the slaughter at Goliad, which makes it relevant whether or not it's true. According to Texas legend, as Fannin saw all of his men being executed, he approached the guard and said, "I know you need to execute me, but when you do it, please don't shoot me in the head. That's not dignified. Instead, shoot me in the heart, which is a more noble way to die. Look, I'll even give you this gold watch if you'll just shoot me in the heart so I can die like a gentleman." Well, according to the legend, the guard took the gold watch and then had Fannin shot in the head anyway. Now, it doesn't matter whether or not this story is 100% accurate, but this is how Texans made sense of the slaughters at the Alamo and Goliad. And when the stories got back to folks in the United States, Americans were incensed by the barbarity of the Mexican troops, and up went the rallying cry, "Remember the Alamo, remember Goliad," and people did. And more Americans volunteered to join the cause of Texas independence. And guess which state sent the most volunteers to Texas? That's right, Tennessee, which is one of the reasons why Tennessee is now known as the Volunteer State and why the Tennessee football team is called the Vols. So then what? Well, after the Alamo and Goliad, Santa Anna and Uriah reunited their armies to attack the last vestige of Texan resistance, a group of 800 or so Texans under the leadership of a man named Sam Houston at a little area called San Jacinto. Now, if you know how to properly pronounce words in Spanish, you probably know that this should be San Jacinto, but even so, Texans rejoice in having their own pronunciation for words, and so it's San Jacinto, and you just have to live with that. Now, by rights, this battle at San Jacinto should have been the end of the Texas independence movement, getting crushed by a vastly larger force that was as brutal as it was merciless. You have to remember, Texans have their own Bible story, so it only stands to reason that when it all looks like all hope is gone, God will provide a miracle. Like the parting of the Red Sea, or turning loaves into fishes, or, in this case, having the opposing army fall asleep. Well, okay, here's what happened. As the Mexican forces drew closer to the Texans, they paused to set up camp in the afternoon so that they'd be fresh for the attack the next day. Many relaxed, some took an afternoon siesta, no one expected an attack. But Houston ordered his Texans to advance, and in the chaos of a sneak attack, Mexican forces were entirely overwhelmed and defeated utterly. Well, you've probably heard the story that history is written by the winners. And so here is how Texas officially explained what happened at San Jacinto. Officially, according to Texas, the battle took 18 minutes, resulting in the killing of 630 men, which is very efficient, and the capture of 730 more, including Santa Anna. And that's right, losing the battle meant that the general in charge, who was also the president of Mexico, had been captured by this ragtag band of Texas rebels. Well, for their part, at least officially, the Texans only lost 9 soldiers and had 30 more who were wounded, including Sam Houston. Now, maybe those numbers are accurate, maybe they're not, but they set up an important meeting that altered the course of American history. Here's another great story I learned back in seventh grade. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. But according to the legend that Texans tell each other, Santa Anna attempted to escape arrest after the battle by trading clothes with a private in the army. And when another army soldier saw Santa Anna's silk underwear, he said, El Presidente! And that is how Santa Anna was captured. Is it true? Possibly. Is it entertaining? 100%. So this scene here depicted in this picture represents the moment at which Texas became an independent country. Essentially, Santa Anna, with guns pointed at him, was brought to Sam Houston, who was lying wounded and resting against a tree, and he was asked, Texas is free, right? And Santa Anna, in no position to object, said, see. And that was the end of that. But unlike other wars or battles, a couple of important things are missing from this picture. The first is an ability for the Mexican government to negotiate freely and equally. There's a reason why treaties are usually negotiated over months and signed in some neutral nation. This negotiation took place at the point of a gun under a tree on a battlefield. And the second thing that is missing is the sheet of paper that would make this whole thing official. Right? With no treaty signed by both sides, is independence legally binding for Texas? And perhaps more importantly, when you say Texas is independent, what exactly do you mean by the word Texas? What are its borders? Where does Mexico stop and where does Texas begin? No one knew. And the uncertainty is what caused the Mexican War 10 years later. But let's linger here on this moment just a bit longer, because Texans, as you know, love the stories that they tell about themselves. So it makes sense that their sports teams are steeped in self-mythology. The Dallas Cowboys, the Texas Rangers, and weirdly, the Houston Texans. But when it came time to add a new Houston soccer team to the MLS, that's self-love coupled with soccer's unfortunate tendency to name its teams after singular abstract concepts like the galaxy or the courage or the revolution. And so the new name for the new MLS team in Houston was the Houston 1836. The Houston 1836. I kind of love that, but I mostly hate it. And so too did many members of the Latinx community in Houston, who apparently did not appreciate being reminded of Mexico's greatest humiliation. And so the backlash was so fierce and immediate, and it eventually led the team to abandon the 1836 nickname in favor of the name the Houston Dynamo. It's still a bad name, but at least it's not offensive. Well, as I said before, Texas revels in stories about what makes it unique, including the fact that for a while, Texas was its own independent republic. A tourism campaign played upon this fact using the tagline, Texas, it's a whole other country. But let me drop some knowledge on you folks. Texas was indeed a whole other country, an independent republic, but it was so entirely against its will. As soon, and I mean as soon, as Sam Houston got up from that tree, he wrote to President Jackson and begged the United States to annex Texas. And Jackson said no, mostly because he was in the last year of his second term, but also because he worried about what might happen if we upset the balance between slave and free states. And so the next year, when Martin Van Buren was now president, Houston asked again, and Van Buren said no, because of the same slave-free state balance issue. And so Texas reluctantly remained independent, again, against its will. After William Henry Harrison became president in 1841, Houston tried again, but oops, Harrison died, and so Houston had to ask John Tyler. John Tyler agreed. which is one of the reasons why the town of Tyler, Texas has the name that it does. However, as you'll remember from earlier in this presentation, everyone hated John Tyler, and so his support meant that Texas couldn't possibly become a state. And it wouldn't become a state until James K. Polk was campaigning for president in 1844. That Texas was finally able to get a glimmer of hope. But the question of what to do with Texas was also tied with the question of what to do with the Oregon Territory. Polk promised to claim Texas and Oregon for the United States. The logic was that the territory gained in the South would be balanced out by the territory gained up in the North. But again, this brings us back to that question. What are the borders of Texas? And frankly, is the United States really willing to fight a war with Mexico over it? And while we're at it, what are the borders of Oregon? And is the United States really willing to fight a war with Britain over it? And in short, the United States could claim all of each territory and fight a war to protect that claim, or it could negotiate. So let's deal with Texas first. When Santa Anna granted Texas its independence under that tree in San Jacinto, he thought that Texas included all the land north of the Nueces River. Everything that was south of that river still belonged to Mexico. You can see the disputed territory here on this map. Texans believed that the borders of Texas extended all the way down to the Rio Grande, and so, looking at the shaded area on the map, you can see precisely what the disputed territory is that Texas and Mexico both claimed as their own. And that's what happens when you don't sign a treaty. It adds to a big gray area, and those big gray areas often lead to wars. Up in Oregon, you might remember that the Convention of 1818 had determined that the entire Oregon Territory, from the 42nd parallel, which is on the map at the bottom of the yellow territory, all the way up to the 5440 line, which is up at the top of the green territory, all of that would be jointly occupied by the United States and Great Britain. So what would we do about Oregon? Claim none of it? Claim some of it? Claim all of it? Well, that's a great question, and it's one that Polk wanted to answer. Well, not surprisingly, the fate of Texas and Oregon became a major issue in the 1844 election. Northern Whigs, who feared the expansion of slavery and a war with the British, their friends, they suggested that the United States should negotiate over both territories. We'd get less, sure, but we'd also risk less, too. Well, Southern Democrats, on the other hand, were entirely in favor of expansion. Of course, they thought we should claim all of Greater Texas, as we like to call that big expanded border, all the way down to the Rio Grande, and to fight Mexico if they resisted. But they also wanted to claim the entirety of the Oregon Territory, and they issued the rallying cry, 5440 or fight. Now, you might wonder why Southern enslavers would want to add more land north of the Missouri Compromise. And it's that the number one, the Missouri Compromise didn't actually apply to this territory. It's just to the territory included in the Louisiana Purchase. And frankly, number two, more land is going to mean more farmers, which means more power for more Democrats. And thus and so, Democrats, in fact, Southern slave-owning Democrats, would shout 5440 or fight. Well, James K. Polk, he's a Southern Democrat, so you might have assumed that he'd just want war with Britain and Mexico, but in truth, he was far more pragmatic than that. You expect that from a University of North Carolina graduate. He knew that there was no sense in fighting a war with our number one trading partner, and conflict over Oregon might distract from his greater priority, which is adding slave territory in Mexico. And so, in the end, he took a middle position, agreeing with Britain to sign what became to be known as the Oregon Treaty, creative, in 1846. Go ahead and add that one to your list of treaties as well. And all it did was it simply extended the Canadian border at the 49th parallel all the way over to the Pacific Ocean, not including Vancouver Island. But when it came to Mexico, Polk claimed all of Greater Texas, all the way down to the Rio Grande, and he sent troops down to the border to protect this newly annexed American territory. Of course, Mexico thought that its northern border was the Nueces, and so it sent troops up to protect its territory. And you could probably guess what's going to happen next. Both sides crossed into the disputed territory between the Rio Grande and the Rio Nueces, and when they saw that there was an opposing army on their land, they both felt that they were being invaded by the other country, and they both started shooting. Both countries thought that they were defending their own territory, fighting on defense. But essentially, what these were two people who were fighting over the same Pop-Tart, right? Which is one of the origins of most human conflict, fighting over the same thing. And that, my friends, is how this war began. And when President Polk heard about the shooting, he went to Congress and he asked for a war declaration using these immortal words: war exists. Indeed it does, President Polk. Indeed it does. And Congress declared war on Mexico to defend its newly annexed territory in Texas. Now, you might think that the Mexican War was solely a border skirmish along the Rio Grande, but in point of fact, there were three main fronts of the Mexican War. Make sure you know all three of them. Front 1 was the border skirmish along the Rio Grande. Front 2 was the struggle to support California in its attempt to get independent from Mexico. And Front 3, the American invasion of central Mexico. Let's deal with each of them one by one. Well, the job of pushing the Mexican army back down south of the Rio Grande fell to this man, Zachary Taylor. Remember how I said that most military people fit into one of two categories, those that are in it for the killing and those that are in it for the uniforms? Take one look at Zachary Taylor, and you can tell that he is in it for the killing, for the thrill and the glory of battle. And perhaps that is why he earned the nickname Old Rough and Ready. And he sure was ready, because he immediately pushed the Mexican forces south of the Rio Grande, and then he didn't stop there, and he pushed them down into northern Mexico, winning battles at Matamoros, in Monterrey, and Buena Vista. Front 1, mission accomplished, thanks to Zachary Taylor, who would become a war hero. And you know what we like to do with war heroes. And so you see the map of him pushing south into northern Mexico. Well, the second front involved California's fight for independence. For as different as California and Texas are today, and they're quite different, their origin story is pretty similar. Mexico sought settlers to come to the northernmost territories, so lots of Americans made the trip across the country and settled both in northern and southern California. But after Texas got independence from Mexico, many in California thought, well, we should follow suit. And uniting under a banner with a big bear on it, Californians fought for independence, first calling themselves the Bear Flag Republic before settling on a much better name, California. And after war was declared with Mexico, the United States sent troops to support revolutionaries in California. In Northern California, John Fremont, who looks permanently startled in this picture, helped to drive the Mexican forces out of Sonoma. And in the South, Stephen Kearny captured San Diego, pushing Mexican forces back into Mexico. And with these two regions liberated, Californians could rejoice in their status as a newly independent country. While the name Bear Flag Republic didn't stick, the symbol of the bear certainly did, which is why the University of California is the Bears and why UCLA is the Bruins. And the flag? Well, a big bear. And curiously, the name California Republic, making it the only state flag that has the name of an independent nation on that. You can bet that just like Texas, California immediately asked to be admitted to the Union. And we're going to cover that a little bit later. Not in this presentation, but a little bit later. First, there's one more front that we need to talk about here in the Mexican War. Central Mexico. Now, thinking back to that Marine hymn that we talked about earlier this year, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, well, we already covered the shores of Tripoli. Now, let's get our troops down to the halls of Montezuma, which means Mexico, which means central Mexico. And to do that, we need another military commander. This one is General Winfield Scott. Take a look at his hat and his epaulets and his shiny buttons. This is a man who is definitely in it for the uniforms. so much so that he earned the nickname Old Fuss and Feathers, making him the very opposite of Zachary Taylor. But here's the main point, folks. Whether he was in it for the killing or in it for the uniforms, both Taylor and Scott were outstanding commanders and extremely successful. Scott landed at Veracruz, pushed into central Mexico, laid siege to Mexico City, and eventually forced the Mexican government to negotiate a treaty to end the war. See, someone learned a lesson here. Sign the treaty. Get the receipts. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, negotiated in 1848, ended the Mexican War. It clarified the border between the United States and Mexico, and it resulted in another huge tract of land transferred to the United States. So here's what that treaty did. First, Mexico agreed to give up its claim to all of Texas north of the Rio Grande, that greater Texas we were talking about, as well as California and everything in between. Second, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million for the land, in addition to another $3 million for any damage that it did in Mexico during the course of the war. You may wonder why the United States had to pay money if it had won the war itself, but remember that, like with the Transcontinental Treaty, the winner will often pay money to the loser so that the transfer of land looks more like a business transaction than a military conquest. But let's not lose sight of exactly what the United States got out of the Mexican cession, as we call it. 525,000 square miles, all of California, all of Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and bits of New Mexico, Colorado, and Wyoming. And that's on top of larger, greater Texas, which the United States had claimed before the war. So between 1844 and 1848, the United States added a whopping 915,000 square miles. Not bad for James K. Polk, who served one term and then went home. And maybe it's best that he did, because with all the new claims of land and new land claims, we end up with the same old question. What are we going to do about slavery out in the Western territories? Remember, this was the question that woke Thomas Jefferson like a fire bell in the night, that the Missouri Compromise had only temporarily settled. And now, here we were, stretched from sea to shining sea, with hundreds of thousands of square miles into which settlers and perhaps enslaved people would soon be moving. What are we going to do about slavery? Well, there are three different options. Option number one, allow slavery in all of the new territories. Not surprisingly, this was a position of John C. Calhoun. To him, slavery was a positive good, so the more slavery, the more good, the better. Option two, however, would essentially become the free soil doctrine. We were not going to interfere with slavery in those states where it presently existed, but we would not allow slavery in any new territory. In fact, as the United States got ready to declare war against Mexico back in 1846, a so-called free soiler named David Wilmot introduced a proviso to the war declaration, fittingly called the Wilmot Proviso. Not a bad band name. And what it said was this: okay, yes, we'll declare war on Mexico, but only under one condition, or proviso, that any land we might gain from a war with Mexico would be closed to slavery. Essentially, any new land would be free land. Well, Southern enslavers saw this proviso as the first step toward ending slavery, and so they worked together to kill the Wilmot Proviso. But the idea of free soil was still there. And now that we had hundreds of thousands of square miles to administer, many in the North thought that this free soil doctrine actually might be a good path forward. And then there was option three, which on the surface of it seems the most democratic. Why don't we just let the people decide? Let the people who settle in those territories decide whether they want to have slavery or not. If more pro-slavery people move into a territory, then slavery will be allowed. If more anti-slavery people move into that territory, it'll be outlawed. Well, this doctrine, called popular sovereignty, also a pretty good band name, was advanced by Lewis Cass. And he thought that it was not only the best solution for the Western lands, but a winning solution as he prepared to run for president in 1848. To put it mildly, The question of slavery in the Western territories was the issue of the 1848 campaign, and so political parties wrestled with how to address that issue. The Whig Party decided that for such a polarizing issue as slavery in the West, the safest position was to have no position at all. That way, you couldn't be punished by people who had strong views, either pro or anti-slavery. Essentially, no plan was better than a plan that somebody out there might not like. And so, as for who might carry out this non-plan, you'll remember that who won the election of 1840. The Whigs did that by nominating a war hero to be president. And so they sent word on down to Mexico asking if old rough and ready Zachary Taylor was rough and ready to accept the nomination of the Whig Party. And essentially, he said, I don't know, well, what do the Whigs believe? And the Whigs essentially said, yeah, nothing. And Zachary Taylor said, well, in that case, I'm your man. When Zachary Taylor came back to the United States and people started asking him about his views on slavery, his response was essentially, next question. He wouldn't commit to anything, which you can get away with if you're a war hero. But a reporter asked him to say what he believed, and this is how Taylor responded. I'm a Whig, but not an ultra-Whig. Okay. If Whigs wouldn't take positions, then what would an ultra-Whig do? Be aggressively non-committal? That's like saying, I like my water lukewarm, but not extremely lukewarm. You know what the difference between lukewarm and extremely lukewarm is? Neither do I. Well, as mentioned earlier, the Democrats chose Lewis Cass and the doctrine of popular sovereignty moving forward. But look at the two major parties on the central issue of the day. One party had no position at all, and the other party thought it best to let the people out west settle the issue on their own. There was no party representing the views of the so-called free soilers, and that, my friends, is why a third party emerged to represent the will of the free soilers. The Free Soil Party attracted the anti-slavery Democrats, who we called barn burner Democrats, and the anti-slavery Whigs, called conscience Whigs, and they named as their candidate for president ex-president Martin Van Buren. Remember Martin Van Ruin, him? Yeah, they were hoping that his name recognition and the free soil policies would be enough to attract support, enough at least to win the election. Did it? No. The Whigs had been right. The safest road to victory here was nominating a war hero and having no opinions about slavery whatsoever. So while we're looking at this map, take a look at the shape of Texas, because it is the first and the last time that it is going to be that huge. If anything, the Mexican War and the election of 1848, they just brought up more questions than they answered. And we will answer them eventually, just not now, because right now we have reached the end of this presentation. So take this moment to look back at the notes you've taken over the past half hour or so. If there's anything that you're still missing or anything you're still unsure about, scroll back and watch it again and take better notes. This presentation is hours of fun for the whole family. Thanks for watching, and I will see you on the other side of the screen.